Here in this exquisite chapel of St. George at Windsor Castle.
The meeting was already tense. Then Charles stopped speaking, and in the silence that followed, everyone in that room understood that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The morning the palace stopped. There are days that announce themselves, days that arrive with a quality of atmosphere, a particular weight in the air, a subtle disruption in the ordinary rhythm of institutional life, that experienced observers recognize before anything has formally happened as days that will not end the way they began. The people who work inside Buckingham Palace, who have spent careers learning to read the emotional and institutional temperature of the building with the precision that proximity to power and proximity to consequence demands, describe March 11th, 2026 as one of those days. Not because anything visible in the morning's opening hours confirmed that something was wrong, because nothing did. And, in an institution where significant events have a way of announcing themselves through exactly the kind of studied normalcy that surrounds them, the absence of any signal was itself a signal. The morning schedule had been set 3 weeks in advance. A high-level internal meeting convened in one of the palace's private conference rooms, attended by a small number of senior officials whose identities have not been publicly disclosed, and chaired by King Charles III himself. The agenda, distributed to attendees by the King's private secretary the previous afternoon, addressed a cluster of institutional matters that had accumulated sufficient urgency. The attendees required the kind of direct royal attention that Charles had been providing with increasing personal effort since the events of the preceding months had made delegation in certain sensitive areas a practical impossibility. The attendees arrived on time. They were briefed, prepared, and conducting themselves with the professional composure that such meetings demand. Charles arrived at 9:47, 2 minutes ahead of the scheduled start. Those present describe his demeanor as focused, as composed as it had been across months of extraordinary personal and institutional pressure, and as giving no indication that the morning was about to become something that none of them would ever fully recover from. The meeting began. The first agenda item was addressed with the efficiency that characterized Charles's management of sensitive institutional business in private settings. Those present describe an atmosphere that was tense in a specific, contained way, that meetings addressing genuinely difficult subjects tend to be tense, but functional, moving forward. The kind of tension that experienced participants in high-level royal institutional discussions know how to work through rather than around. Nothing in the first 30 minutes distinguished this session from the dozens of similarly weighted meetings that Charles had chaired across the preceding year. And then, approximately 40 minutes into the session, something changed. Not dramatically, not with the kind of visible, physical precursor that might have given the people in that room a moment to prepare themselves for what was coming. The change was in Charles himself. A quality of presence that had been steady, focused, and entirely characteristic of the man they had been working with for the preceding 40 minutes simply altered. Sources who were present describe it with the particular verbal precision of people reaching for language adequate to something they witnessed but still struggle to fully process. One attendee, speaking under strict conditions of anonymity, described it as watching a light change behind someone's eyes, not extinguish, change. The quality of attention and awareness that had been fully present in the room suddenly becoming something less than fully present, without the external physical signals that might ordinarily accompany that internal shift. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. The sentence itself has not been disclosed by any source, and the attendees have been consistent in their silence about the specific subject being discussed at the moment it happened. What they have described, with the kind of shared consistency that comes from multiple people experiencing the same moment from different positions in the same room, is the silence that followed. A silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds in clock time, and that sources describe as feeling considerably longer than that. The kind of silence that a room full of experienced professionals generates when every person present has simultaneously understood that something has gone catastrophically wrong, and that none of them has yet processed what the appropriate response is. The person seated immediately to Charles's left moved first. What happened in the seconds and minutes that followed that movement, who was called, what the room's emergency protocols produced, and what the people present saw in those first critical moments before the palace's medical response arrived, is the chapter that the institution has been most carefully managing since March 11th. Stay with us because What triggered this collapse, and what Charles had been carrying into that room, is the story that makes everything else make sense. The meeting, the agenda, and the weight Charles was already carrying. Begin not with the agenda item that was being discussed when Charles stopped speaking. Begin further back than that. Begin with the man who walked into that conference room on the morning of March 11th and ask yourself what he was actually carrying when he sat down at that table. Because the clinical question of what caused his collapse, the medical answer that the palace's communications team has been so careful to manage, it is considerably less complete than the fuller answer that emerges when you understand the accumulated weight of everything King Charles III had been absorbing across the preceding 14 months without the external world ever being given an accurate picture of its true dimensions. Charles became king in September of 2022 at the age of 73, the oldest person ever to ascend the British throne. He had waited longer than any heir in recorded royal history for that moment. And when it arrived, it brought with it not the relief that a lifetime of preparation might have been expected to produce, but something considerably more demanding. A reign that began in grief, continued through his own cancer diagnosis 17 months later. Later, it accelerated into a succession of institutional crises that would have tested a monarch of 40 in perfect health. Charles was neither. The cancer diagnosis of February 2024 had been managed publicly with a discipline that those closest to him describe as one of the most remarkable acts of personal fortitude of his entire life. He had continued his public duties. He had maintained his schedule with modifications that were presented as routine adjustments rather than the concessions to serious illness that they actually represented. He had appeared in public with a consistency and a composure that the watching world had largely accepted at face value because he had given it no visible reason to do otherwise. What the watching world had not seen was the private reality that his closest aides and medical team were managing daily. The treatment cycles, the recovery periods, the days when the gap between what his body was capable of and what his role demanded was bridged only by the particular combination of duty and stubbornness that has defined Charles's character across his entire adult life. And then, into that already compromised physical foundation, the events of 2026 had begun to fall, one after another, with a relentlessness that sources close to the king describe as having a cumulative effect on his physical condition that the medical team had been monitoring with increasing concern since January. The audit findings had not simply been an institutional crisis, they had been a personal one. The documented evidence that funds connected to Camilla's orbit had been moving in ways inconsistent with established protocol had required Charles to confront something that every instinct of personal loyalty had been resisting for months. The private investigation he had commissioned had cost him something that no institutional language can fully describe: the act of formally investigating his own wife, of reading the findings alone, of sitting with the documented evidence of conduct that the woman he had fought 30 years of public hatred to place beside him had chosen, knowingly and repeatedly, to engage in. The strip titles had cost him more, not the decision itself, which sources confirm he had reached with a clarity that surprised even those closest to him, but the living with it. The daily reality of sharing a residence, a household, and a marriage with the human consequences of a decision that his institutional judgment had demanded and his personal life had to absorb without the catharsis of public acknowledgement or the relief of private resolution. The formal recommendation of March 4th had been the heaviest thing of all. William's recommendation had arrived on his desk not as a surprise, but as the inevitable conclusion of a process that Charles himself had authorized and supported at every stage. He had read it. He had sat with it. He had gone to Camilla and stayed 40 minutes and emerged with the face that the senior courtier in the corridor had described as emptied. And then he had continued, as he always continued, because the institution required it, and because stopping was not something that Charles had ever permitted himself in 77 years of life, defined by the absolute primacy of duty over personal cost. What the meeting agenda on March 11th added to that accumulated weight was a specific item. One subject, introduced in the second half of the session, that sources describe only as deeply personal in its institutional implications and directly connected to the events of the preceding months. It was the discussion of that item, sources say, that was underway when Charles stopped speaking. The wait had found its limit, and the mourning stopped. Stay with us, because what happened in that room, in the seconds after the silence began, is where everything changes. The moment of collapse and the immediate response. There is a protocol that exists inside every royal residence for exactly this kind of emergency. Not a printed document distributed to household staff at induction and forgotten in a filing cabinet somewhere. A living protocol, rehearsed, updated, and maintained with the seriousness that the protection of a reigning monarch demands. Every senior aide, every private secretary, every member of the household staff whose daily duties place them in proximity to the king knows their specific role within that protocol. Who calls whom, in what order, using which channels, with what specific language that communicates the nature and urgency of the situation without using words that, if overheard or intercepted, would detonate across the world's media before the medical team had reached the room. The person who moved first was the official seated immediately to Charles's left. A senior aide whose identity has not been publicly disclosed, but whose institutional role placed them in the closest physical proximity to the king during the meeting. They moved within 2 seconds of Charles stopping, not with the visible panic that the situation might have produced in someone less trained for it, but with the particular controlled urgency that rehearsed emergency response produces in experienced professionals. A hand on the king's arm, a low, direct communication to the official nearest the room's internal telephone, and a simultaneous signal to the 2 protection officers stationed outside the conference room door, whose presence at every meeting Charles attends is so routine that their absence would itself constitute a breach of protocol. The protection officers entered within seconds. The palace medical team, whose members are stationed within the residential complex during all working hours precisely because the king's age and health history demand immediate rather than approximate medical response, was notified through the internal emergency channel at 10:24. Sources with knowledge of the timeline confirm that the first medical responder reached the conference room within 3 minutes of that notification. 3 minutes. In the context of a serious cardiac or neurological event, in a 77-year-old man undergoing active cancer treatment, 3 minutes is the difference between outcomes that the palace's communications team would be able to manage and outcomes that it would not. What the other attendees did in those 3 minutes tells its own revealing story about the specific human reality of being present when something catastrophic happens to the most powerful person in the room. Several remained seated, sources say, in the particular frozen stillness of people whose professional training has not prepared them for the specific emotional reality of witnessing a king become physically vulnerable in front of them. One attendee moved immediately to assist the senior aide supporting Charles. 2 others, following their own institutional instincts, positioned themselves near the room's exits in a way that sources describe as the physical manifestation of people who understood that the next thing required of them was to ensure that what was happening in that room stayed in that room until the appropriate people had been notified through the appropriate channels. The medical team's initial assessment took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which the conference room became, in effect, a medical space, with the attendees gathered at its periphery in the particular helpless proximity of people who had no useful role to play and understood that remaining calm and contained was the only contribution their presence could make. What the medical team found during those 11 minutes is the information that the palace has been most carefully managing since March 11th. The initial assessment communicated to the room was that the king was stable. That word, stable, was chosen with the precision that medical professionals use when they want to communicate reassurance without communicating the full picture, because stable and well are not the same word. Stable means the immediate crisis has been contained. It does not mean the crisis is resolved, nor does it mean that its causes are understood, or that the man now being carefully assisted from the conference room to the palace's private medical suite was in the condition that his public schedule and his communications team's carefully worded statements had been suggesting he was in for the preceding several months. He was assisted from the room at 10:38. The meeting was formally suspended. The attendees were asked to remain available and were escorted to a separate waiting room where a senior official joined them within 20 minutes to deliver a briefing whose contents, sources say, were considerably more measured in their reassurance than the expressions on the faces of the people delivering it suggested they had any right to be. The palace's communications team was notified at 10:41. Their first internal discussion about what to say publicly began at 10:43. What the medical team had actually found, and the gap between that finding and what the palace eventually told the world, is the detail that changes everything about how this story is understood. Stay with us because that gap is wider than anyone outside that building has yet been told. What the medical team found and what the palace was told. There is a particular architecture to the way the British royal family manages medical information about its most senior members. It is not simply a matter of privacy, though privacy is always the stated justification. It is a matter of institutional stability. The monarchy's relationship with the public depends, at a fundamental level, on the perception of continuity, the sense that the institution is solid, present, and functioning, regardless of what is happening to the individuals inside it. Medical information, particularly medical information about a reigning monarch, threatens that perception in ways that no other category of sensitive palace information quite replicates. Because it introduces into the public consciousness the most destabilizing question the monarchy ever faces: what happens next? The palace has managed this architecture with considerable sophistication across Charles's reign. The February 2024 cancer diagnosis was disclosed publicly, but the specific type was not. Treatment was confirmed, but its intensity and duration were not. Updates were provided at intervals carefully calibrated to satisfy the public's reasonable expectation of information, without providing the kind of clinical detail that would allow independent medical experts to assess, publicly and accurately, the true state of the king's health. It was a communication strategy built on the principle of transparent opacity, saying enough to prevent accusations of concealment while revealing little enough to maintain control of the narrative. What the medical team found on March 11th challenged that strategy more severely than anything that had preceded it. The initial assessment conducted in the conference room had established that Charles had experienced what the medical team categorized internally as a significant cardiovascular episode. Not a heart attack in the clinical sense that the public understands that term. Something more complex, more directly connected to the specific physiological stress that cancer treatment places on the cardiovascular system, and more indicative of a broader deterioration in the king's overall physical condition than any single diagnostic category could adequately capture. The medical team's language in their internal communications, recovered through sources with direct knowledge of the assessments, was precise in a way that the palace's subsequent public statements were notably not. They described a pattern of physiological stress indicators that had been present and documented across the preceding 6 weeks, and that the March 11th episode represented not as a sudden event, but as the visible culmination of a created, progressive deterioration that had been building beneath the surface of the king's publicly maintained composure. 6 weeks. The medical team had been monitoring warning signs for 6 weeks before March 11th. That detail, more than any other single piece of information to emerge from the day's events, tells you the most important thing about the gap between what was found and what the palace said. Because if warning signs had been present and documented for 6 weeks, then the meetings Charles had chaired, the public engagements he had fulfilled, and the institutional decisions he had made across that period had all been made by a man whose medical team knew he was approaching a threshold that his schedule and his communication strategy were not reflecting. The public had been given a king, the medical team had been managing a patient, and on March 11th, the gap between those two realities closed in a conference room in front of 7 witnesses. The palace statement released at 2:15 that afternoon described the king as having experienced a period of fatigue during a morning engagement, and confirmed that he was resting comfortably under medical supervision. It expressed confidence that the king would resume his duties following a period of rest, and noted that his medical team was satisfied with his current condition. Every sentence of that statement was technically defensible. Every sentence of that statement was also in the context of what the medical team had actually found and documented. A masterpiece of institutional understatement that the 7 people who had been in that conference room would have struggled to read without a particular kind of internal discomfort. What the small number of palace officials authorized to receive the full medical briefing were actually told was something considerably different. They were told that the king's treatment regimen required immediate and significant modification, that his public schedule needed to be reduced substantially and immediately, and that the question of operational continuity within the royal household required urgent attention in a manner that went beyond the temporary arrangements that had been sufficient during previous periods of reduced royal capacity. In plain language, they were told that Charles might not be returning to his previous level of function, and that the institution needed to prepare itself for that reality now, quietly, and without the public acknowledgement that would transform a managed medical situation into a constitutional crisis. William was already being notified, and what he did in the 15 minutes after that notification arrived is where the monarchy's future truly begins. Stay with us. William takes control. The notification reached William at 11:03 on the morning of March 11, 2026, not through the palace's formal communications system, through the direct personal channel that William's protection team maintains for exactly the category of emergency that requires him to be reached immediately, completely, and without the delays that institutional routing introduces, even in urgent circumstances. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, William was already moving. Those 4 minutes are worth sitting with, because what William did in the hour that followed them tells you more about the current operational reality of the British monarchy than any official statement, any palace communication, or any carefully managed public appearance has told you in the preceding 3.5 years. He did not go to the hospital wing where Charles had been taken. He did not make the calls that a son managing a family medical emergency makes first. He made the calls that the operational head of a major institution makes when the person who formally occupies the top of that institution has just become incapacitated. The son and the future king occupied the same body. The future king moved first. His first call was to the keeper of the privy purse. His second was to the palace's most senior constitutional legal advisor, the same Sir Anthony Woodhouse whose counsel Charles had sought before signing the documents that stripped Camilla of her institutional roles. His third was to Princess Anne. That sequence, and its specific prioritization, is something that sources with knowledge of it describe as the clearest single indicator of how completely William understood what the morning had changed and how thoroughly he had prepared himself to respond to exactly this moment. What he put in place in the following hour was not the improvised crisis response of a man caught off guard. It was the activation of a framework that sources say William had been quietly developing since the earliest months of Charles's cancer treatment. A contingency architecture for the operational continuity of the monarchy that addressed the specific institutional vulnerabilities that a period of reduced royal capacity would create. Key decision channels rerouted. Specific authorization processes temporarily restructured to ensure that the business of the institution could continue without the delays that the absence of a functioning monarch would otherwise introduce. None of it formal. None of it publicly acknowledged. All of it, in the assessment of the constitutional advisors who were briefed on it, entirely consistent with the established conventions governing the transfer of operational royal responsibility during periods of monarchical incapacity. The palace, meanwhile, was holding its breath in the specific way that large institutions hold their breath when something significant is happening at their center. And the full picture has not yet been distributed to the people who need it to do their jobs. Staff who had no direct knowledge of what had occurred in the conference room that morning understood, through the particular atmospheric signals that palaces generate when the ordinary rhythm of institutional life has been disrupted, that something was wrong. The carefully maintained composure of senior officials moving through the building with a purposefulness that slightly exceeded the ordinary registered with the people watching them in the way that slightly excessive purposefulness always registers. Something had happened, something was being managed, and William was at the center of the managing. The succession question that nobody in or around the palace was willing to say out loud was already answering itself in the actions of a prince who had stopped being merely a prince some time ago without anyone formally acknowledging it. Stay with us, because what the reign that is already beginning actually looks like is the final chapter this entire story has been building toward. The reign that is already beginning. Charles did not die on March 11th, 2026. That statement needs to be made clearly and without equivocation before anything else in this final chapter is said. He was treated. He was stabilized. He was moved to the palace's private medical suite, where his team began the immediate modification of his treatment regimen that the morning's events had made unavoidable. He is, as of the most recent information available to sources close to the situation, alive and receiving care. That is the factual baseline from which everything that follows must be understood. But here is the truth that the factual baseline does not capture, and that the palace's carefully managed communications have been constructed specifically to prevent the public from fully registering. The king, who will return to his public duties, in whatever reduced and carefully managed form that return eventually takes, will not be the same king who walked into that conference room on the morning of March 11th. Not because the collapse changed him personally, because it changed everything around him. It changed what his medical team will permit. It changed what his constitutional advisors will recommend. It changed what William will accept in terms of the gap between what Charles's public schedule suggests about his capacity and what his private medical reality actually reflects. The pretense of full royal function, maintained with such extraordinary personal discipline across 14 months of cancer treatment and institutional crisis, is no longer sustainable. Everyone inside that palace knows it, and the institution is reorganizing itself around that knowledge, whether the public statement acknowledges it or not. What that reorganization looks like in practical terms is what William's actions on the morning of March 11th had already begun to establish, before Charles had been moved from the conference room. The contingency framework William activated in those first 60 minutes is not a temporary arrangement designed to bridge a short period of reduced capacity and then be dismantled when the king recovers. It is, sources confirm, a permanent restructuring of how operational royal authority flows through the institution. A restructuring that places William at the center of every significant decision in ways that his formal title as Prince of Wales has never previously reflected, but that the operational reality of the monarchy now requires. For Catherine, whose own recovery from cancer had positioned her as the most publicly beloved figure in the royal family, and whose role as William's strategic partner had been expanding steadily across the preceding year, the morning of March 11th represented the moment the future she had been preparing for arrived ahead of the schedule anyone had publicly acknowledged. She was briefed by William personally. She was present in his council across the critical decisions of that day. She is, in every operational sense that matters, already fulfilling the role that her formal title will eventually confirm. For the British public, the picture being presented remains one of a king receiving appropriate medical care and expected to return to duties in due course. That picture is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that the events of March 11th make increasingly difficult to sustain as a full account of where the monarchy actually is. The reign of William V has not formally begun. The crown has not passed. The constitutional moment of succession has not arrived. But the operational center of the British monarchy shifted on the morning of March 11th, 2026, in ways that no subsequent palace statement, no carefully managed public reappearance, and no amount of institutional communications management will shift back. Queen Elizabeth built her structures, she placed her trust, she wrote her directives, and the grandson she chose to hold everything she spent her life protecting is holding it, exactly as she always knew he would.